Wonderful. We're going to get right to it. Thank you so much, Linda, for all of your guidance. You came up with the idea for this program, this series, and we're all grateful to you. Chris, we will feature quite a bit this evening, and a star of the show is up here in this suitcase, and I'll tell you about the star in just a second. But we're on the inside of this program. I hope you have one or can look on with a neighbor. And these are the 6 episodes we are going to view this evening, in order from top to bottom. That's convenient. The first one is tied to something called Lake Lewis. And you're like, I don't think I know where that is. And it's because Lake Lewis doesn't exist anymore. It's a lake that existed during the Ice Age, down by Tri-Cities, southern Washington, and there's beautiful evidence for that lake. Without further ado, let's view the Lake Lewis episode. It takes about 5 minutes. And then we'll have a little bit of Q&A. If you've got some questions, if you've got some comments, and we'll just try to keep this thing moving. There's 6 of these 5-minute programs we're going to view, so we're just going to try to keep it rolling the best we can. Are you ready in the back? Yeah, man. We're going to do Lake Lewis episode that's going to premiere tonight on television at 8:45, by the way. So here we go. Nobody has seen this yet. You'll be the first to see it.
Crack the mysteries of the Earth. Discover the energy that drives a planet and builds mountains. Uncover buried treasure and see what makes mountains blow. Find out what shapes the top of the Earth and explore the secret world below. With me, Nick, on the rocks.
This is Main Street of ZILLAH, Washington, probably known best for its agriculture. There's orchards and vineyards surrounding the town, but geologists know ZILLAH because the little town sits directly on top of evidence from giant floods that happened 16,000 years ago.
But instead of loud, angry, destructive floodwater like at Dry Falls, the lake beds here at ZILLAH were created when each fast-moving Missoula flood was stopped cold, temporarily, by Wallula Gap near the Tri-Cities. Why? The water couldn't all get through the gap at once, so there was a backup. When the Missoula floodwater finally drained to the Pacific, what was left? One Ice Age lake bed, a record of an Ice Age flood. But look, along the Yakima River at ZILLAH, there are over 30 lake beds stacked one on top of another. And here at Granger along the Yakima River. And here at White Bluffs along the Columbia River. Count up the lake beds, and you count up the number of Missoula floods all the way from Montana. At Burlingame Canyon, near Walla Walla, there are 40 beds. Amazing. When did this happen? We only have one date so far, and the date doesn't come directly from the lake beds.
This is volcanic ash, white, with a bunch of gray layers above and below. What's going on? Looks just like the ash of Mount St. Helens in 1980. It is Mount St. Helens. It's not 1980. This is much, much older. This has been dated at 16,300 years ago. That's the level of precision that we can get from this ash. And this ash is important to us because this is the only place we've got in the Lake Lewis Basin to know exactly where we are time-wise. And the sharp definition is important, telling us this was a momentary eruption of ash in a place where we did not have lake water, but we certainly had a lake before and after, multiple times.
Bruce Bjornstad, a geologist and author based in Tri-Cities, has devoted 40 years to studying the Ice Age floods in eastern Washington. In addition to the lake beds, he has worked with stranded boulders in the desert that snap the details of Lake Lewis into sharp focus.
The river behind me is at 300 feet elevation. The elevation of this erratic is about 1,000 feet. So if you do the math, that's 700 feet of water that once filled this valley, the ZILLAH Gap, by an ice age flood. It's angular, which is a sign that it was probably embedded in an iceberg. The ice melted away, leaving behind the erratic that we see today.
Lake Lewis lasted only a few days. But still, that was enough time to create these fascinating lake beds, multiple ice age floods, a strong stamp of water out here in the deserts of eastern Washington.
Okay, look at this guy right here. That's Chris Smart. Don't sit down. Don't sit down. So that's Chris Smart right here. Keep standing, please. Chris Smart. Soak it in. Soak it in. Bruce Bjornstad, the guy that we probably interviewed for, 25 minutes and ended up with less than a minute on screen. Bruce, would you stand up, please? And Neil took a truck and loaded all of us up and all the camera equipment and drove us to the top of ZILLAH Gap. Neil, where are you? Neil came up from Tri-Cities. Neil, with this truck. So, last year, if you came, we did a little bit of back and forth about what you liked and what you didn't like, and we just kept it moving. And I'd like to do some of that, but we can also just ask a question. These are appetizers, aren't they? Most of you are hardcore geology buffs. I know that, because you've come to a lot of our stuff, and we're just scratching the surface. So are there questions that naturally come to mind where you want more information? Or was there an image that you're particularly excited about? Or have you got something negative to say? Would love to hear that too. Not really, but go ahead if you want to. Marty. Yes. You heard the question. The question was, that ash bed is intriguing. Why is it so perfect? Is that ash that fell out of the sky from an eruption of Mount St. Helens after one of those lakes, and then the lake dried away? The ash came down, but when the next lake came in, why didn't that ash get swept away? The key concept is the water was quiet. At that spot, Lake Lewis is truly dead calm water. And that's maybe something we could have done better. Upstream, further north, the water was coming over Dry Falls and doing that crazy velocity thing. But when you're at Benton City, which is where we did that little ash bed thing, it's right there next to the road. The water is dead calm. So there was no erosive energy to take that thing away. Anybody else curious about anything that you saw? Yes?
Have you ever drilled a core all the way to the core all the way down to the basalt?
Yes, we know the depth to the basalt bedrock at most of those places with the chalky white layers. And you would think it shouldn't be that hard. If there's a dozen chalky white layers in one place, like we showed, and 40 in that queer canyon called Burlingame Ravine near Walla Walla, can't you just count up the number of layers and figure out how many floods there were? The problem is, which layers are which? These layers are so difficult to distinguish. And geologists like Bruce Bjornstad and others have been trying to come up with new techniques to figure out how to correlate these things all across the Pacific Northwest. A couple of others before we move on to the next question, the next episode. Yes?
You said that the lakes went down in a couple of days.
How do we know the lake only lasted a few days at a time? And that was one of the messages, that each of those thick layers was from a lake that existed for less than a week. There's a couple ways to answer it. One is involving math and the size of the deposits and the size of the lakes and how much time it would take to drain the water, because that lake existed because of this narrow ZILLAH Gap. And I think of Lake Lewis like a bathtub full of water with an open drain. And so you only have a certain amount of time before that water is going to totally drain out of the bathtub. A more satisfying answer might be, there are no old shorelines where the high water of Lake Lewis used to be. Some of you know about Missoula, Montana, and you can actually see on the cliff above the University of Montana, you can see these old shorelines of these glacial Lake Missoula. There are very few places you can see any shorelines, and so that's more evidence that that lake didn't last for very long. Maybe a few days is pushing it. Maybe it's a couple of weeks for one of the lakes. Bruce? 3 weeks Bruce likes. He likes that number. Here's one more. How do you date the layers without organic material? We still don't have a way to date the individual Lake Lewis chalky white layers. Those are still undatable. But the ash, we can get a date for because there are minerals inside of the ash that came from Mount St. Helens. We know the ash came from Mount St. Helens because there's a chemical fingerprint of that ash which matches perfectly with the chemistry of the mountain. And we can get radiometric dates from some of the minerals inside of the ash. But if you got the impression that we knew the dates of each of the lake layers, that's not what we were trying to say. There's hardly any organic material in those slack water sediments, and so it's one of the mysteries that remains involving the Ice Age flood story. Okay, we can't hold it. We got to say one more. Yeah.
How much time between each flood, and was it predicated by an ice dam upstream?
The question is, can we say anything about the timing of this? We have a lake, and then it goes away, and here comes another lake. How much time is that between one lake and the next? It depends on which geology you talk to, because the dates aren't precise enough yet to figure that out. A nice kind of back-of-the-envelope thought is that you have a Lake Lewis for 3 weeks, it drains away, we wait 50 to 100 years, we have another lake. 3 weeks, it drains away, another century. In other words, that's the time it takes to fill another glacial Lake Missoula. But if you talk to a Canadian geologist, they say that's baloney. Not all of your floods are coming from Montana. Some of the floods probably are coming from British Columbia, and you can see how this gets out of control in a hurry. Hey, we're moving on, and I'm going to open this lid, and then I promise to close it again, Chris. This, if you get to a point tonight where you're like, how long is this thing? How many more of these are we going to watch? This is ridiculous. In other words, if you're bored, here's a little game you can play with yourself. How many aerial shots are in a particular episode? And those that know some of the stuff I've done a long time ago, we used to have a dude who got up in an ultralight and would fly this thing and get aerial video for us. And that's Tom Tabbert, who's in Spokane. And I'm still working with Tom by email, but we don't use him anymore because of this. This is Buddy. This is Buddy the drone. And we don't send humans up in the air anymore to get the aerial photographs. This is the actual drone that Chris uses. And when we're out filming on the ground and me talking into the camera, that's fine. That lasts a little bit, and then my work is done. And then we sit in a couple of lawn chairs and open the cooler. And Chris has his controller in his lap, and he sends Buddy up. And he sends Buddy this way and that way, and then we can't see Buddy for a while, and then we can see Buddy again, and see if you can keep track of how many aerial shots, especially in this next episode called Steamboat Rock, which was available to us by drone thanks to the State Parks Department. Ryan Carlson and David McWalter are with us from State Parks, and they made these aerial shots available. Is Steamboat Rock next in your program? Well, then that's what we're going to look at. Steamboat Rock in the Grand Coulee. Let's do it.
Crack the mysteries of the Earth. Discover the energy that drives a planet and builds mountains. Uncover buried treasure and see what makes mountains blow. Find out what shapes the top of the Earth and explore the secret world below. With me, Nick, on the rocks. Steamboat Rock in Washington's Grand Coulee. It looms like a battleship above Banks Lake. And before the construction of Grand Coulee Dam in the 1930s, like a steamboat grounded by a departed tide, silent as an old wreck. How did Steamboat Rock form? Like most places in eastern Washington, Steamboat Rock is made of dark-colored basalt lava rock, giant lavas that flowed 16 million years ago. But perched high on top of Steamboat Rock, there's a granite boulder that has a story to tell.
So I got a question for you. How do you think this thing got up here? Water bring it in? A glacier? It's an erratic. In fact, there's hundreds of these light-colored erratics, these boulders, on top of Steamboat Rock, which is 800 feet tall, an island of bedrock in the middle of the Grand Coulee. We need to study these boulders to tell the story of what happened here during the Ice Age.
Here in northern Washington, the Columbia River basalt bedrock, usually 2 miles thick and dominant, is thin because we're at the margin of the Columbia Basin's lava seam. You can actually see the underlying granite bedrock below.
Now, looking up the guts of the Grand Coulee, it's not the size that tells you something unusual happened here. It's the shape. This is a box-shaped canyon known as a coulee, carved quickly by the Ice Age floods.
These rare box-shaped valleys like the Grand Coulee have a catastrophic origin.
16,000 years ago, there was a dam here in the Columbia River Valley. Not today's Grand Coulee Dam, but an ice sheet, the Okanagan lobe of the Canadian ice sheet that positioned itself in this valley, stopped the water of the Columbia River, and sent it south. So when a big Ice Age flood came from Missoula, Montana, the water was sent south over land to cut the Grand Coulee quickly.
After the destructive, catastrophic Ice Age flood erosion, Steamboat Rock stood 1,200 feet tall. In fact, it was the view from Steamboat Rock that planted the seeds for what became the Columbia Basin Irrigation Project. As early as 1892, local dreamers and schemers began promoting a plan to irrigate the deserts of central Washington with water diverted into the Grand Coulee from behind a dam on the Columbia. Today, Banks Lake is Columbia River water that has been pumped south to sit in the floor of Grand Coulee. So Steamboat Rock was created by the aggressive erosional power of the Ice Age floods, along with the rest of the Grand Coulee. But what about our granite boulder on top of Steamboat? The ice sheet itself was right here. The glacier dropped these rocks at this elevation. And then the Ice Age floods did their magic, carving Ice Age landmarks here in northern Washington, the Grand Coulee and Steamboat Rock.
Okay, Eastern Washington. You know, I'm picturing this socialite couple in Bainbridge Island, you know, getting ready for dinner, and this comes on. They're like, where the hell is that? You know, the hillbillies over there, they got some interesting stuff. That's kind of, I'm starting to realize the audience for these programs are folks who would not normally pay any attention to geology or our side of the mountains. That was me stalling for you. Do you have any questions or comments about the Steamboat Rock episode? Yes, sir. The music editing on this is quite spectacular. Chris, any comment?
Thank you.
That's another thing to listen for and look for when you watch these, how polished the transitions are and when the music is brought in. And I've looked at them enough to know when we Can I give away some of your secrets? A little bird stuff comes in that's sometimes not natural. Is it going to bring in a couple of birds when you want to? Yeah.
If Steamboat Rock is 700-foot sheer cliffs on all sides, how'd you get on it? Did you use a helicopter?
The question is, if Steamboat Rock is 700 feet on all sides, how do you get up there? It's a couple guys over 50 that are carrying their tripod and their camera. There's a couple trails. They're kind of steep, but you can get up there. How many people have been top of Steamboat Rock? See, this is a hardcore group, so there's a good 50 people in here have done that. So I recommend it on the south side especially. In the case of Chris, we loaded up. We packed up. You got this. You got the batteries. You got this. Good. About 45 minutes on our way up, almost to the top. Chris is like, oh, shit. What did you forget? The battery for the camera or the drone? So Chris went all the way back down, got the battery, came home. All right. Couple more from Steamboat Rock. Yes? The make and model of the drone. Chris, this is a Phantom 4 by DJI, and it is a couple years old, and there's 4 battery packs to keep us going in the field, and this is what the controller looks like, and I've never flown one before, so why am I doing this? I don't know. Yes, you can get one. Bruce has one. Who else flies a drone in here? Anybody else? Yes, sir. So, amazing stuff that you can capture. A couple more from this one. Marty. Chris, would you stand up, please?
I've taken it about 1.5 miles away from the controller. And what? I've lost it. No, I've never lost it, but I did crash it in the ghost forest. You'll see that episode. But fortunately, the grass was about 5 feet tall, and so it didn't hurt the drone, and we sent it back up. And it's a huge forest, and what's odd is later on in the day, I crashed it again in the exact same tree. So I'll never have to worry about that.
I've been with a few other camera people who like flying drones, and they're very cautious, and they're checking the wind and everything. I want to make sure everything's just right. And I like Chris. He's just like, let's see what this thing can do. He's flying all over the place, and he's getting some stuff that is helpful to us. How about one more question from Steamboat? Yes.
Are the erratics from Montana or from British Columbia?
The erratics on top of Steamboat are light-colored rocks. To my eye, they were mostly granites. And there's granite bedrock not very far away. So I'm not sure we do need to go into British Columbia or Montana. Especially Montana bedrock that got picked up and moved by the floods are metamorphic rocks and sedimentary rocks and look like Rocky Mountain rocks. These are granite-like rocks. Do you have a better answer for that, Bruce? So probably not Montana and possibly British Columbia, but not that far. I'll tell you what, we're going to keep it moving. What's next? The PALOUSE. So we're still in Eastern Washington, as you heard Linda say, and Linda's been working hard to spread this to other stations. We're going to have people watch these episodes in, Pocatello, Idaho, and Southern Oregon, and they're hopefully going to be intrigued, where are these places, including the beloved PALOUSE that we all know and love. So that's where we're going next. The loess of the PALOUSE Hills. Take it away.
Crack the mysteries of the Earth. Discover the energy that drives a planet and builds mountains. Uncover buried treasure and see what makes mountains blow. Find out what shapes the top of the Earth and explore the secret world below with me, Nick, on the rocks. The rolling hills of southeast Washington. More than 100 feet of soil make this one of the richest farming regions on the planet. But where did the soils come from? Is it true that the soils are volcanic? Rich and fertile volcanic soils blown downwind from active Cascade volcanoes?
The answer is no. This is wind-blown silt. The soil's out here in the Palouse. There's hardly any volcanic ash in this stuff. This is loess. And the minerals in the loess are light-colored minerals. Surprisingly, the bedrock below the loess, basalt, has dark-colored minerals in it. This is unusual because usually soils are the result of parent material, the bedrock, breaking down. But out here in the Palouse, the loess is soft, the basalt rings like a bell.
So where did the loess come from? The Canada ice sheet to the north and mountain glaciers of the Cascades to the west. The glacial ice ground bedrock down to kitchen flour. The silt got flushed onto plains in front of the ice. And then winds blew the loess onto the landscape downwind. Over 2 million years, the entire span of the Ice Age, the silt piled up to form the Palouse Hills, a lasting legacy of our glacial past. Palouse Falls, the official waterfall of Washington State, lies on the Palouse River. The waterfall is tucked into a coulee that was carved quickly, 15,000 years ago, by powerful angry floods. It was right here, along a major path of the Ice Age floods, that all of the loess was swept away in an instant, leaving only interconnected canyons that surround the majestic falls. But nearby, the undulating green landscape stretches on and on, untouched by the destructive floods. And the yields keep coming from the fields. There's never been a crop failure out here in more than a century.
Loess is the Goldilocks of soils. The texture, the grain size, is just right for storing water. Months of snowmelt being stored perfectly in these soils. If the hills were made of sand, the water would drain too fast. If the hills were made of clay, the water would pond, be too wet. So the Goldilocks soils, the loess soils, the texture is just right for storing water.
Kevin Pogue, a geology professor from Walla Walla, teaches among the rolling hills of Goldilocks soils. He's become an expert consultant for an exciting new industry in eastern Washington.
Well, the reason we can grow such great grapes and make such terrific wine is we have a soil that's just ideal for allowing drip irrigation to be managed by the viticulturalist. You know, you don't want the berries to be too big or the clusters to be too fat. You want a higher skin to juice ratio so you get more flavors from the grapes. You want the sugar content of the grapes and the acid content of the grapes to be absolutely in harmony. And one way to control that is through the way you manage water.
Water and soil, a magic combination. Ice Age loess, setting the table for one of the richest agricultural regions in the world. Palouse loess.
Okay, maybe you like that one a little bit more. It felt like that was a little bit more enthusiastic, not that I'm paying that much attention. Very good, okay. It's green, wine, why wouldn't you like it? Right. Comments, questions, concerns?
Throw in manila soil, the layers, ZILLAH,
Yes.
are they the same
Yes, interesting connection. The question is, our first episode had those chalky white layers deposited by the Ice Age floods in an Ice Age lake. The question is this the same stuff? And the answer is pretty much yes. If you're in a place where the Ice Age floods are carving, they're picking up a bunch of the loess and then redepositing it down in Lake Lewis when the water stops. So that's another way to view the first episode. It's this stuff that gets carried and redeposited. Nice call. Yes, Don.
Nick, you had went past a very quick photograph of a striped hillside or canyon wall.
Yeah.
What's that?
We went through a real fast striped hillside. Was it in the loess? Was it the green stuff? I'm not. See me in my office, Don. We'll talk about that afterwards. I can't quite place what you're asking about. Sorry. Do you know what he's talking about, Chris? Okay. We'll do. If you're curious about the writing of these episodes, I'm a science guy, so I write out the script and I have, stats and things. And the process is I then give it to an English major, Linda, who you heard at the beginning here. So she gets the red pen out and says, so there was some interesting turns of phrases there if you were listening to the words, and that's all Linda kind of making this language work with the visuals. A couple others from the wine that I know very little about. By the way, Kevin Pogue said, I don't care what you do, but don't call this episode Palouse Hills, because you're in Walla Walla, and this is not, the Palouse. But what did we end up doing? We called it the Palouse Hills. Yes?
Did you film from Steptoe Butte?
We did not. Chris, did you film from Steptoe Butte? How did you get some of those? Tell us how you got some of those Palouse scenes.
The majority of those were shot from Steptoe Butte up above, and so just went out there on two different occasions. The first time it was really cloudy, and just the weather just wasn't permitting decent shots, so I went back out again. And then also my son Julian is here, and we went out years ago shooting stills in the Palouse, and you happen to see a couple of stills in the video. The last shot was one that I think maybe even Julian picked up. So. No stories at Palouse. What you see is basically what you got. But I was about a half a mile from the drone, and just watching it on the viewfinder, and was able to get into the falls, and that's it.
Thank you. Yes.
It's a huge factor, and it's scary because there was one time that we were shooting, and it was so windy that I had it full throttle heading toward us, and it was actually moving away from us. And the battery's getting low, and we were over the Columbia River. So there's times when it's really dicey, but we've been lucky so far, very lucky.
I give the impression we're sitting in lawn chairs flying this peacefully, but here's my impression of Chris while he's flying the drone on windy days. Oh, God, I don't see it. Oh, God, where is it? Oh, God, oh, no, oh, God, where, do you see it? I don't know. Oh, I think it's gone. Oh, no, there it is. And you'd never dream it with the hypnotic vistas that you see. Oh, God, oh, where is it? One more, John. Was Don asking about the crop patterns? Is that what you were asking about? No. So see me in my office, both of you. Okay, we're moving on. We're keeping it moving. How many we got left? 3? Oh, my Lord. Will this night ever end? Hopefully you're not feeling that. So we're moving on. What's next? Deception Pass. Well, we're on the other side of the Cascades now, right? We've all been to Deception Pass? How many people have been to Deception Pass? State parks guys, is it truly the most heavily visited park? Among them. Okay. So Ryan Carlson is giving us the stats there. Beautiful place. Challenging place to just keep to 5 minutes. There's a lot going on geologically at Deception Pass. Here's our attempt.
crack the mysteries of the Earth. Discover the energy that drives a planet and builds mountains. Uncover buried treasure and see what makes mountains blow. Find out what shapes the top of the Earth and explore the secret world below. With me, Nick, on the rocks. The bridge at Deception Pass. The views are incredible. You can see all the way to Mexico, but only if you look down at the extraordinary bedrock below the bridge. Bedrock that formed in a deep ocean, then was added to Mexico, and then made the long journey to northern Washington.
Look at this stuff. Kind of looks like ribbon candy, doesn't it? It's rock. Up to 160 million years old. This stuff is from the deep ocean floor from the age of the dinosaurs.
These chert layers are made of silica-rich skeletons of tiny single-celled organisms called radiolaria. They float for about a month in the ocean before they start sinking. Like diamonds deep in the earth, the silica skeletons face incredible pressure from the thousands of feet of water overhead. As a result, the tiny skeletons are transformed into chert bands, silica-rich rocks that tell a deep ocean story. Is it possible that these rocks were accreted in Mexico and then sent north almost 2,000 miles?
Up until pretty recently, we basically had paleomagnetic data. There weren't good geologic arguments for where these rocks were, and secondly, how do you get them up 3,000 kilometers along the coast? But now, just in the past several years, detrital zircon work, where workers from University of Calgary and elsewhere have analyzed samples of the Nanaimo group, which is part of the San Juan Islands, and found that the detrital zircons very likely were eroded from granitic rocks at the latitude of Los Angeles, the Mojave Desert. And so I think now this has caused a resurrection and interest in the Baja BC hypothesis, because it is a completely different line of evidence that you could use to argue in support.
And the evidence comes in all shapes and sizes. Exotic looking bedrock like this all up and down the west coast of North America. Granitic mountains with a tropical paleomagnetic signature, all the way down to little single grains of zircon minerals that are new kinds of evidence that tell us that rivers long ago in Mexico traveled over bedrock like this. It's now clear to many geologists that everything in western Washington that's older than 50 million years ago was part of this Baja BC movement. Anything younger than 50 million? The Cascades, the lavas of eastern Washington, the Ice Age floods, that's homegrown.
Deep ocean rocks that not only made it to dry land, but also got sent packing almost halfway to the North Pole, are just another reason to enjoy Deception Pass State Park.
Okay, that's kind of ambitious, wouldn't you say? You're trying to talk about an idea that involved 2,000 miles of movement. It's like, what is that guy saying? It's like somebody's in the kitchen popping some popcorn. It's like, huh? So, I don't know. I don't know how well that will go over, but what are your thoughts? Yes?
Why did you choose not to show a cartoon to set the stage?
Why didn't we use an animation to set the stage or to help illustrate this? So, We got a shoestring budget. Just a map. So that was discussed back and forth a few times. So some of this, I won't go on forever, but some of this is, do we focus on landscapes? And those of us that love geology and science, we want a diagram, we want a map, we want basically a living textbook. We want to keep going back to the content. But again, we're starting to realize this is a different kind of an audience. So instead of a map, which may have helped, instead of an animation that may have helped, the animations are very expensive, and the last episode we're going to look at has a sexy animation, but for the most part, we don't have enough money to keep paying these guys. I thought it would help, Kelsey, but did not make the final cut. It's a collaboration. Yes, what do I know? Back here, anybody? Yes, Bob.
Does this also mean then that the Olympic Peninsula, is that also exotic terrain, or is that more oceanic and wet?
The answer is no, and so that's a potential confusing area as well. We're looking specifically at Deception Pass, which has this Mexico story. But much of the Olympic Peninsula is a different story, with a huge Hawaiian-like island called Silesia that was formed off the shore of Northern California and then got added about 51 million years ago. So yeah, some people might take liberty and just say, okay, well, they got the San Juans behind the guy from the UW, and they're talking about. So there are problems when you do little appetizers. I think people maybe instinctively fill in a bunch of gaps on their own, which I don't know how you can police that necessarily, but yes, we're hoping not to talk. Maybe we need a separate San Juan Island episode that emphasizes that. Linda's nodding her head. Maybe we need a separate Olympic Peninsula show, which has been talked about, but we can't get the drone into the national park. We don't have nice people like state parks helping us with the national parks. If you have a relative who works for Olympic National Park, please tell us about him or her so we can figure out how we can fly our drone at Hurricane Ridge. Anybody else? Yes? How did the rocks get from Mexico to Washington? I'll do it in 2 minutes. The San Andreas Fault is a strike-slip fault. Each time there's an earthquake on the San Andreas, the west side of California, the west side of the fault, lurches north about 20 feet on average. And we are mapping strike-slip faults that are much older than the San Andreas, that when they were active, were doing the 20 feet to the north every time there was an earthquake. And if you have thousands and thousands of earthquakes on hundreds and hundreds of faults, you can eventually do that kind of motion. And the knowledge we have of the old tectonic plates that used to exist are oceanic plates that were moving north during this time that we're talking about. And so even though it seems like an absolutely bizarre idea, and it was considered bizarre 50 years ago, has a new momentum behind it because we've got new ways to quantify that. So doing it in 4 minutes is not easy, and that wasn't our intent, of course, but that's the obvious question. That's right. Hey, we got 2 more, according to my math, and we're going truly out to the coast of Washington now. We're going past Olympia, through Aberdeen and Hoquiam, which takes forever, and finally get through there. And we're going to the Green Lantern Inn at the mouth of the Copalis River and a place called the Ghost Forest. Have you heard about it? Probably the most famous place for geology in the Pacific Northwest. Let's look at the episode. Ghost Forest. Doing a great job back there, whoever you are. Thank you.
Crack the mysteries of the Earth. Discover the energy that drives a planet and builds mountains. Uncover buried treasure and see what makes mountains blow. Find out what shapes the top of the Earth and explore the secret world below. With me, Nick, on the rocks. The famous Ghost Forest at Washington's coast. These trees have been dead for more than 300 years, and yet many still stand. What killed them?
a 700-mile-long fault. The Cascadia Subduction Zone lies 55 miles that way, offshore, underwater. It's not that far away. A magnitude 9 earthquake, a great earthquake, ruptured on that fault and shook the Pacific Northwest coastline from Vancouver Island in Canada clear down to Cape Mendocino in Northern California.
This great earthquake struck on Friday, January 26, 1700, at 9 o'clock at night.
Native American stories are all we have from that terrible night. And yet there are clues out here, geologic clues, if you know where to dig. You like mud? You ought to come to the Ghost Forest. There's no shortage of mud. It's a tidal marsh. The tides bring in mud, they deposit it in this quiet area. It takes a pretty clever geologist, I'm not the clever one, to dig here and find something that's not mud. But in this hole, I've gotten down deep enough to find a clean 4-inch layer of fine-grained sand. Now, what is that sand doing here? It's a tsunami deposit. A series of waves from the great earthquake generating a tsunami and sweeping in here on that winter night in 1700.
This is famous tsunami sand because the geologist who discovered it back in the 1980s, Brian Atwater, traced these deposits through tidal wetlands along a 700-mile stretch of the Pacific Northwest coast. But to find the year of the great earthquake, Atwater looked to the Ghost Forest itself, and he needed the help of a dendrochronologist, a tree ring expert, Seattle scientist David Yamaguchi.
Once we had the ring dates of these trunk samples, because we're missing outer wood here, we next went after the roots of the same trees and matched these rings against the rings of the trunk. And these outermost ring dates turned out to be 1699, which was perfect because in January of 1700, historical waves were recorded as hitting the 600 miles of Japanese coastline. And then the following summer of 1700, these trees were already dead.
The earthquake killed these trees, but it wasn't from the ground shaking, it was from the ground suddenly dropping 6 feet. And these trees were killed because their roots of the western red cedar were plunged into salt water. Death by saltwater poisoning.
Until Atwater's discovery, ghost forests held secrets of the world's largest earthquakes. The work of Atwater and Yamaguchi completely rewrote our understanding of earthquake risk here in the Pacific Northwest, and eventually, the world.
Comments about the Ghost Forest? What do you got? Yes? Is it the same event that affected the Macaw area, the on the coast? Yes, yes. There are. We didn't cover it in this episode, but we now realize that there are multiple tsunami deposits. We were just looking at the most recent, but if you dig deep enough, or if you have a low enough tide, you can see multiple tsunami deposits. So we know this happens every 500 years or so, and it's been 319 years since the last one. Yes?
I think it was good that you invited David Yamaguchi to comment. He's kind of an important player, but he stayed in the background a lot. It's good that you brought him out.
Thank you. The comment is, it's good that we featured David Yamaguchi, the guy who did the tree ring work. He was a partner with Brian Atwater. Atwater usually is on camera telling the story, and so we went with the David Yamaguchi part of it. And a nice fellow as well. Anybody else about the ghost forest? Yes?
I'm curious, Nick, did you dig that hole or did you bring your grad student?
In the back is a young lady named Tristine. Tristine is waving to you right now. So Tristine has been an invaluable intern with this program, hired by Premier Jackson, who's also in the back there. So Tristine has only been with us on one of our location film things, and it happened to be that ghost forest deal. No, I dug my own hole, Bob. She didn't dig the hole, but we had a canoe and a flat-bottom boat. We had a guy from Olympia, Rob, who guided us up this river. I don't even think about this stuff. You got to if you're going on a river that's going to the ocean, you got to look at the tides. You got to make sure you can get in and get out without tide problems. And Chris got out of the boat and sunk in to his waist, and he had a hard time doing anything with his camera because he's like, I'm sinking. And so he got him back in his boat. And so Tristine was a great help to just negotiate all that mud. Yes?
I think the footage of you trying to navigate, trying to walk in that mud and move your shovel is probably almost as funny as you dropping your hammer.
Yeah. So the comic relief of the guy struggling in the mud is almost as good as a geologist losing his hammer down a crack. I agree. A couple others before we get to our last episode. Ghost forest. Are you curious about anything with that specific place or wherever you want to go here?
Lake Washington, the north end of it, supposedly
Yeah.
got an underwater forest that might have been slid off of like St. Edward's Park.
Yeah.
Did that happen at the same time?
Not the same time. So it's a question about, some of you may be aware that in Lake Washington underwater, there's an underwater forest. And if you're a boater on Lake Washington, you get hung up in those submerged trees. And it is now clear that those trees were submerged in Lake Washington 900 AD, so older than this one, during the Seattle Fault earthquake. So there was a tsunami in Puget Sound, but that was just some landsliding happening in Lake Washington. So that's a common question. If we're dealing with dead trees, is it all from one earthquake? And the answer is no. And in fact, the Seattle Fault is a shallow crustal earthquake, totally different and lower magnitude than the coast thing. So there's a lot of different kinds of faults and earthquakes and events to keep straight. David, State Park Ranger from Dry Falls.
The Ghost Forest, it is actually Washington State Park. So for those who want to visit, you can stay at Ocean City State Park or Pacific Beach. And yes, a Green Lantern is a fine spot to stop.
So if you didn't hear that, David from State Park says it is now part of the state park system, Ghost Forest. Pretty undeveloped, it's safe to say. You can't walk your family up the river. There's no boardwalk or anything, but wild and scenic, just as we like it. Hey, I think we should do our last episode and then wrap it up for tonight. We've saved an episode, this last one. We almost are showing these in the sequence that we filmed them. So now we're Labor Day weekend, and we're Gorge Amphitheater, and we're on the Columbia River below the Gorge Amphitheater, and we got tremendous help from a local couple. Would you mind standing for a second? Gary and Catherine live in Sunland Estates. And, social media is not the greatest for many reasons, but it's helpful in this case. If you I post things occasionally, filming such and such, and I think I was whining once. I posted something. I wish I could get over to West Bar to the Ripples. I've never been able to get over there. And this guy says, I'll get you over there. I got a boat. I got a house. Come over. We'll have a barbecue. All right. We'll go over, film a little bit. I'll get a buddy. We'll come back. We'll cook up some steaks, and we'll get a little beer going, and we'll make it an evening. And that's what we did. We didn't film all that, but Gary got us across the river from Sunland Estates over to West Bar, a place I'd never been before. Took a boat to go to Kittitas County. Kittitas County, the very far eastern edge of Kittitas County, is this giant current ripples show that we'll finish up with here tonight. Thank you for your attention. Giant ripples.
Crack the mysteries of the earth. Discover the energy that drives a planet and builds mountains. Uncover buried treasure and see what makes mountains blow. Find out what shapes the top of the earth and explore the secret world below. With me, Nick, on the rocks. The giant ripples of West Bar, just upriver from the famous Gorge Amphitheater. What do these ripples in central Washington tell us about our geologic past?
Even though this is a desert today, those ripples behind me were created 14,000 years ago when a massive ice age flood of water came barreling through this Columbia River Valley. How do we know the date? How can we prove that water made those ripples? There's evidence out here. Let's investigate.
Geology is built on the adage, the present is the key to the past. Where do we see ripples in nature today? On a beach for sure, but also in the desert, right?
This is amazing out here. Have you ever walked on top of sand dunes before? It's a good workout for the legs. But if you stop and look carefully at the surface of these dunes, there's a beautiful little community of ripples. There's wind out here now, and the wind is blowing over the surface and creating the ripples. Each ripple is 1/4 of an inch high. The ripples are spaced about 3 inches from crest to crest, kind of like a big Ruffles potato chip. The point is, without current flowing over this surface, these ripples would not exist.
The current here is wind. But ripples also form when the flowing current is water. The size and spacing of the ripples are a direct result of the speed and depth of the water. When you hike on the giant ripples at West Bar, you can't even really tell they're ripples because they're so darn big. Each giant ripple is 40 feet high and 100 yards from crest to crest. Instead of fine sand, these ripples are made of gravels and boulders. Even the powerful Ellensburg winds can't move rocks that big. You need water, and you need a lot of water. The dimensions of the giant ripples at West Bar point to a powerful force that only could have come from a sudden catastrophic flood of water. The Ice Age flood that created the ripples was 400 feet deep and more than 40 miles an hour. Enough power to shear off the faces of valley walls, leaving rare, razor-sharp cliffs in its wake.
So the date, how do we figure this out? How long has this boulder been sitting here on West Bar? There's a new technique involving the surface of the boulder. Look, this is a clean surface without lichen on it. The geologist comes in, breaks off the outer rind of the boulder, sends it to the lab, measures parent and daughter isotopes created by cosmic ray exposure, a surface exposure dating technique, 14,000 years for this boulder right here.
Music fans at the Gorge Amphitheater are drawn to the venue for its unique natural setting. All eyes are fixed on the performers on the stage. But how many in the crowd can see the drama that played out behind the stage long ago?
behalf of Tristine and Cremere and Linda and Chris, thanks everybody for coming tonight. We'll see you next year. How about that? Thank you much. Goodbye, everybody.